Thank you. And the last and final speaker of this session is Dr. Fabio Alberto Ambrosio, who will talk about Sultan Veled and the humility of love, please.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I will talk in English, even if I appreciate a lot to talk in Turkish. This time it will be in English. Located almost in the middle of the Sultan Veled's book of wisdom, the Kitab al-Ma'arif, the chapter on the humility, or if I give the title of this paper, on the humility of love, is an extremely interesting treatise on mysticism. In this chapter, in fact, we discover fundamental and essential elements of the mysticism of Rumi and his son Sultan Veled. Here I give the result of the inquiry into these pages that stands as deeply spiritual. The study of this chapter leads to a proper synthesis of what could represent the relationship between the father and the son, or better, between the master and the disciple. Surprisingly, the Kitab al-Ma'arif, as important as it has been translated, of course, into Turkish, but among the European language, only into French by Eva de Vitray-Miyerovich. This fact had led me the first time to go deeper into the understanding of Sultan Veled by Eva herself. Finally, after having studied for a while her perception of Sultan Veled, I came across this chapter from the book of wisdom, and I realized that this was a real theology and a powerful synthesis of the relationship between Rumi and even Sultan Veled. Anyway, it is not uninteresting to take some thoughts from Eva de Vitray-Miyerovich, who translated a lot of Rumi's poems and Sultan Rumi works into French. Eva explains that the Kitab al-Ma'arif was always published at the end of several manuscripts of the Fi Mafi of Rumi himself. This is why she asserted that, I quote, if the doctrine of inspiration and true stories of the master and his disciple is the same, the real author of both texts is ultimately Rumi himself, although the presentation is not the same. The Book of Wisdom, with respect to the Fi Mafi, has a more elaborate discourse, is less spontaneous, and probably reflects a more explicit concern. Eva affirms what is the starting point of this present inquiry. I quote, Eva, the form is less diversified, few interlocutors involved. There is a short discussion and few questions. Each chapter is a whole, more consistent, some of them somewhat similar to a sermon. The methodological approach of this paper is to consider one of the chapter, the 19th of the Persian text, 19th chapter, as a whole treatise on love and especially on humility. Eva adds that the fact that Sultan Veled has redesigned the teachings of his father and was relying on what he considered especially important cannot be doubted, but the spiritual master is again the same. The chapter of the humility of love is thus a real and a true paradigm for understanding both the place of love in the anthropology of the spiritual man or the Sufi believer and the relationship between the master and the disciple. A third level of analysis is represented by the deep relationship between this chapter and the Christian theology of love and the union with God as viewed in Christian mysticism. If I speak of real paradigm, it is because this text can be read in the light of the Sufi life as well as the implicit counterpart of the relationship between Rumi and Sultan Veled. We can read the entire chapter bearing in mind these two key areas: a treatise on love and humility and the profound relation between the father and the son. The more we study the one, the more we will deepen the other. I don't have probably the time to summarize the chapter. You will take the 19th chapter of the Ambarci Olu Turkish translation. You will have a great reading. Following the various pieces of this beautiful spiritual mosaic, the internal organization of the chapter allows identification of the core and the development around the main message. Indeed, when we look more closely at this list of the contents of the chapter, the theme of humility toward God and man as a fundamental attitude of the believer emerges. It is this reduction of man towards God that the believer may approach closer to God. But his humility becomes visible, as it were, in the human face of man touched by the divine grace. This is why the whole chapter can be read as a testament of the life of Sultan Veled with respect to his father. If we encounter all the time the report of the disciple to his master, we can replace it with the relationship of the son to his father, and finally we could further penetrate the secret of life. Analogic comment. Discovering the love for God and humility in the company of Sultan Veled, the reader moves to the truth of man in front of God. From the outset, the author of the chapter says, humility for the love of God is the glory. The French translation, I worked with both texts, of course, the Persian one and the French one, and Eva Vitray de Meyerovich, who was very close to the Mevlevi tradition, translated tawazu with for humility for the love of God. That is not the real translation. Humility for God is the glory. As the humble himself has lain down for the love of God, it is actually like he had lain down before God himself. He who lays himself down in front of God does so in order to love him more and in order to approach him more and more, as Sultan Veled asserts afterwards. From the depth of humility, the believer sees himself as in a mirror. That's why, I quote Sultan Veled, knowledge is obtained in proportion to the humility. By this humility manifests his own greatness. All the elements are there to analyze these fundamental relationships. Let's are they to say it, this game between proximity and distance, high and low, between the master and the disciple. The basis of this laying down is not a thing in itself, but the object is important for the people laying down. One must lay himself down in front of God in order to be high. But in front of the earthly realities, you have to be contemptuous. It is the goal, the object that gives value to humility. That's why Sultan Veled continues with the story of the dervish who, on going to the hammam, meets an old man who rubbed the feet of the client with his beard. The dervish felt great humility with respect to this man and decided to pray for him the divine grace. But when he learned that the old man was a mere employee of the steam room and gave the same service to all, he changed his mind. The initial humility proven to the man turns to consideration of the ignorance of the old man. The fact that he had not recognized the value of the dervish confirms that his humility was not of the right sort. If his bird was the washcloth for all customers, his inferiors, consequently his humility had no special value. I quote, "It is in front of the mystics that we need to reveal humility, silence, self-effacement, so that it has value and that this be recognized. If you bend yourself in front of them, they will adjust you and turn copper into gold, as you are the elixir of their greatness. You have found the reality of existence in this annihilation and perfection in this breath. The size of the object makes the fair value of humility. If the man who lowers himself to the mystic, representing, in a sense, God's greatness, it is like he was before God himself. His humility makes him great. It is from this point on we may consider that the Sultan Veled's meditation as a spiritual autobiography with respect to the relation with his father. He lowered himself, Sultan Veled himself, lowered himself to his father in order to give glory to God. His lowering himself to the mystic makes him great. I quote, "If you die for the love of God, you will be resuscitated by love. The soul would make you alive, dancing, moving. After that, the love of God makes you alive. Love doesn't die. Aşk ne mirastı, aşk kadimastı, aşk azelastı. Şon yuhibbuna yuhibbuhum." He will love them and they will love him. Here there is talk of a digression on God's love and on understanding in the mysticism of Rumi. Sultan Veled here reflects the thinking of his father, who is very clear in the introduction to the second book of Masnavi. Love is a divine attribute. If a creature loves, it does so as a reflection of God's love they found in themselves. God raises the human and spiritual rank to the extent, respectively, that the man is lowered. This lowering of oneself is, as it has been said before, to the creature not casual. I quote Sultan Veled, "We must show humility and submission to man of God and to God. His power is the prophet and the believer." From this passage on, the humility towards God appears with that towards to the man sent by God. Who are they? These are prophets, the saints, but behind all these figures, Sultan Veled cannot prevent himself seeing the face of his father. Conversely, he must avoid people in this world, those who are far from God. In this regard, his word is very illuminating. The saints are from the heavens. When you stretch out your hands, they allow you to be higher, and they will deliver the scourge of hell. The humble man is like a green branch. You can try to pull it down, it does not break. He who knows the lowering himself to the true realities, to the man of God, is like the green branch. Humility is associated with a green branch that has to bend without breaking, while false humility is a branch that breaks. The explanation of humility by the image of the green branch opens a possible interpretation of the relationship between the master Rumi and the disciple Sultan Veled. It is a treatise on fine human psychology. Again, not every humility is in itself good. The matter of the humility must be inherently good, great, glorious, as God and his saints. But the condition of humility is also important, just as its object. He may lower himself to God and to his saints, but if he is not convinced of this humility, then it would be as the green branch that breaks because it is not really fresh. Sultan Veled says, on the contrary, in the non-spontaneous humility, if by artifice he shows great humility and he offers his heart to someone, he dwells in a lower level and he constantly regrets, what have I done? And he considers himself ruined by this action. Humility itself may be one cause for regret, because the attitude with which one who lowers himself was not fair and good. It was a false humility. The relationship between Rumi and Sultan Veled was deep, but this passage from the Kitab al-Ma'arif suggests it could be a sort of document proving the inner struggle of the son who wanted the greatness of the father, even emulating the humility. In a purely historical perspective, one might consider these passages as indicative of the difficulties with the greatness of the father. The inner struggle to recognize the value of his father, having to defend against the attacks of criticism around, was created by Sultan Veled's feeling. The rest of the chapter will also provide part of the solution, both theoretically and practically, regarding Sultan Veled, if one accepts the idea that his words were as a reflex of his inner life. And I will cut a little bit to go through the conclusion. Through this chapter, and then you will probably have the papers of all the conferences. I have some more minutes.
Okay, you have up to 5.
Throughout this chapter, and because I'm a Dominican preacher, I used to preach every Sunday morning, and the principle is not to preach along because people bother. So it's better to preach not far, not very long, to give people the desire to continue to listening. Throughout this chapter, Sultan Veled was able to follow the development of the treatise of humility. The humility of love through the depths to which this attitude can lead. Love has an object, and it is for this object that a man can lower himself until self-effacement. Self-effacement refers to the annihilation realized by the greatness of God. The more you lower yourself, the more you stand in front of God. The more we prostrate, the more we stand, using the words of Sultan Veled. The lowering is also achieved with respect to men who are close to God. But who is the saint or the mystic in which we can be confident? It is precisely he who lowers himself to God's greatness. Yet he who lowers himself is never sure to be in front of a saint, a friend of God. The doubt could always be present, but dismissed because of man. So a man can be bad, but able to convert to God, and can be very fair and like to stay a saint in the eyes of man. This process and very doctrinal Sufism encourages Sultan Veled to attain the foundation of humility, the starting point of this treatise. The solution of any doubt can issue even his personal life of discipleship and then mastership, also resolved by entrusting entirely in the power of God. Humility is not based on its own strengths and convictions, but on the real forces of God. If Sultan Veled ever experienced doubts about the intrinsic value of his father, sometimes quite justified criticism of his entourage and the visible transformation of personality, they will have experienced everything he brought in this chapter. The power of humility dwells in God, who removes all doubt and leads to divine secret. At the beginning of this contribution, I pondered the three axes contained in the study of the text: the treatise of humility, the chapter on the humility read in the eyes of the relationship between Rumi and his son, and finally, the Christian and theological resonances. There is no room here to browse the text with reference to Christian doctrine and mystical love, but I would like to conclude with a short sentence of Thomas Aquinas, one of the most important theologians of the Christianity, and who lived at the same time of Sultan Veled. This is what Thomas Aquinas says, commenting on the prayer called Our Father. This same humility is observed in this prayer, for true humility is had when a person does not presume upon his own powers, but from the divine strength expects all that he asks for. Thank you very much.